Good evening. My name is Candace and I'm an event manager. On behalf of the rest of the staff at Town Hall and our friends at Third Place Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream presentation with Audrea Lim, and Elizabeth Alvarado as part of our science series. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Audrea and Elizabeth for appearing tonight to help make that possible. If you share in Town Hall's vision for a robust community engaged in the arts, science, and culture, where everyone has a voice, please consider supporting us tonight by donating or becoming a member. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include our Global Rhythms series with Drew Gonsalves of Cobo Town presenting Caribbean Calypso music. Pardis Madavi is in conversation with the Stranger's Rich Smith to discuss the prolific use and history of the hyphen as a grammatical tool. And Donna Miscalta joins us with an assembled panel of writers to discuss how their mixed race identity informs their work. You can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Tonight's presentation will be about 60 minutes, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player, so please submit those at any time. You can also text questions to 206-504-2857 as noted in the chat. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, you can click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The program will be available for re-watching immediately following the event. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Matulski Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, the Northcliffe Foundation, Winco Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Lastly, you will want to dive deeper into this evening's topic by purchasing a copy of the book. Please use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy through Third Place. And now for this evening's program. As the world's scientists declare a climate emergency, the fight to protect our planet's ecological resources and the people that depend on them is more urgent than ever. But our speakers tonight believe that the real battles for our future are taking place far from the headlines and international conferences in mostly forgotten American communities where the brutal realities of industrial pollution and environmental degradation have long been playing out. Audrea Lim is a Brooklyn-based journalist who has written for The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, The New Republic, and The Nation. Lim is a former editor at Verso Books, a large independent press, and she is also one half of the pop drama electronic duo Odd Rumblings, and co-producer and co-host of the Asia Pacific Forum on WBAI 99.9 FM in New York City. Elizabeth Alvarado is a multimedia freelance journalist with a passion for exploring social issues within communities of color. Based in Washington State, she has covered the Latinx community around Seattle and has worked abroad in Mexico City reporting on women's issues. Through her writing, she aspires to give a voice to those who feel they aren't being heard. Lim is the editor of, and Alvarado is a contributor to, the new book, The World We Need, Stories and Lessons from America's Unsung Environmental Movement, and that is the subject of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Alvarado and Audrea Lim.
Hi, thanks very much for having us. And good evening to all of you. I'm going to show you the book and just start off by just telling you a little bit about the book and why I put it together, where the ideas that shape it, where they came from. This is basically an anthology. It's a tour through some of the grassroots groups and movements who are tackling environmental and climate issues today, often in conjunction with other issues that are usually thought of as separate, for instance, like racial justice, prisons, community development, gentrification. So as an anthology, it includes, stories that are reported by a lot of talented journalists from around the country. It includes lots of interviews and group interviews with activists, organizers, and thinkers. It includes galleries of artwork from, the climate and environmental movement. And I sort of think of it as a tapestry of stories about how environmental campaigns and groups, how this movement sort of grew from the lives and experiences of ordinary people. So the sort of genesis behind it was, I began working on this book in 2018 when, at the time the climate crisis had started to be taken seriously as this like mainstream and very pressing issue. But at the time, even though it felt very urgent, it also felt like this massive, daunting, like systems-wide problem that would require us like all to change literally everything about our lives and society, from our cars and taking vacations on airplanes to like getting rid of, everything made out of plastic in our homes, which is, basically everything. So, at the time, the Green New Deal had been introduced as a broad proposal for doing this, for shifting our society in this direction. But it was also this like very abstract program. And I remember even talking to some people or overhearing some people who even actually supported the Green New Deal. They would quietly be like, but, what exactly is the Green New Deal? Like, people sort of had trouble envisioning it. It's just too big and abstract. And similarly, I think this idea of a just transition had been batted around. Like the term had been like floating around, but a lot of people couldn't really conceptualize what it is. And what the term just transition means is it's basically a shift away from the fossil fuel based extractive economy, but also toward a more equitable, more just, and regenerative economy. So there's a positive vision to it. So the book's intention was to provide this patchwork vision of, the different small groups that have, some of them for many, many decades, like almost half a century, have been chipping away at the big overarching question that we now face as a country, or even as a civilization, really. Like, the question of how do we transform our society in a way that not only shifts us away from the carbon intensive fossil fuel economy, along with the kinds of development or like agricultural practices and kinds of human relationships that have sort of gotten us into this mess. But like, how do we also shift toward a society that is more equitable, more just, and actually just more humane also? So yeah, many of the groups that are in this book have like not only been fighting corporations and industries that were polluting air and water in their neighborhoods or towns, that like those are what we think of as classic environmental issues. A lot of these groups that are in this book, and there's like, I think there's something like 40 chapters in this book. So there's quite a lot of ground covered here. A lot of these groups were also working toward like a more positive, holistic vision of a society, or really their neighborhood or community that's, not just low carbon and clean, but also, just and regenerative. So basically their own little local version of a just transition. So these groups have been thinking about this question, many of them, for a really long time, and just at like a smaller local scale. I've mentioned that this book includes, reported stories from journalists, interviews, and artworks. Where Elizabeth sort of comes into this is that the book also includes a few really, really just excellent and relatable, I think, personal essays from people who lived, work, or grew up in environments that have been threatened or are still being threatened by environmental devastation or climate devastation, or just climate change, like the effects of climate change. So these include, there's a personal essay from a third generation coal miner turned environmental activist. In the Appalachians, there's a woman who wonders if her thyroid cancer was a result of years of her like eating fruit, delicious juicy fruit off the trees in Vieques, Puerto Rico, which was a U.S. military bombing site and still like very heavily polluted from that. And there's also Elizabeth's essay. So I work as both a book editor and a journalist who covers climate and the environment, and like social justice, racial justice, economic justice movements. And I encountered Elizabeth's work, like as I was putting this book together, because of an excellent article that she had written in the Seattle Globalist. Probably, Elizabeth, when you were still like a college student or a while back.
Yeah, I was in college. It was for an internship I was doing.
Yeah. But yeah, I was really struck by the personal way that she talked about this experience of working on the Sakuma Brothers farm, which is, a berry farm in Bellingham that supplied and maybe still supplies the multinational corporation Driscoll's. We probably all eat their berries from when we buy them at the, grocery store. I had previously done a little bit of reporting on a network of organizations that the workers at this farm were closely tied to. Those organizations were sometimes like built by workers from the same farm. So there was like Community to Community, which is like a woman-led grassroots farm worker organization that fights for food sovereignty, immigrant rights, workers' rights. There's a farm worker union, which is mostly organized by those workers. And now it might sound like this network of organizations and the issues that they work on, which is like labor organizing, immigration. These things might sound like they have nothing to do with climate and the environment. And you might be thinking like, why are these what stories in the book? But like one of the themes that I think runs through the whole book and really shapes is really the framing for the book, is that and it's also a very big part of Elizabeth's essay, is that our work environments, our home environments, our recreation or play or entertainment environments, just like everywhere that we exist in, all the different places, like those are all the environment. They're all part of the environment more generally. Like the environment is not just national parks or like the rivers that are outside the boundaries of the city. When these various environments, they become polluted by an industrial plant or highway traffic, or when when work environments or living environments just become, when climate change makes them a lot more inhospitable, whether that's through like flooding or extreme heat or smoke from wildfires, like environmental justice and just environmentalism in general, like those things also are labor issues then. If it's happening in a residential neighborhood, that's also a community development issue. So I'd like to turn to Elizabeth now. And your story, the story that you tell in this essay, is just really fascinating. And you talk about the farm, the Sakuma Brothers farm, as it's actually one of the places you grew up in. So like maybe I call it like the environment of your childhood. Would that be accurate?
Yes, I would say that's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
I remember there was the first place where my dad worked when he immigrated from Mexico to the United States. He was 17 years old and they had him picking berries. And if you ask my mom, she says that he was probably one of the worst pickers ever. So that's why eventually he ended up leaving Sakuma and he went to work at a potato farm. But my mom and the rest of my family continued working there. My mom is from Texas, so they were migrant workers. So they would travel around to different states for whatever crops were in season and they would work there. So every summer they would come down to Burlington, Washington, which is where the Sakuma Brothers farm is, and they would work there. And then I had been around there, but I'd never worked there or anything until I was 12 years old. They had set up a kids program for the summer. So it was like 3 weeks where kids 12 to 13, I think, could go and pick berries and they would pay us like 6 cents a pound. And I remember being so upset when my mom told me, she's like, you're going to go and pick berries this summer. And I'm like, no, mom, why? And she's like, because we all did it. You need to see what your family has gone through for years and years. So there I was picking berries at 12, and it was not very fun. This reminds me of a tweet that I just saw recently. It said something like, cute date idea, picking strawberries. And if someone were to come up to me and be like, yeah, let's go pick strawberries for a date, I would probably run in the opposite direction because it is not as romantic as it sounds. So, for those of you who have never actually been out in the fields and picked berries, you have to be down in the dirt and then you have to move all the leaves from the strawberry plant and you slide your thumb underneath the stem while you're holding the berry and you like very gently have to pull it off so you don't squish the berry. So doing that for 6 hours a day as a 12-year-old was a very hard experience. I just remember coming home every night. My body was so sore. I had dirt caked under my nails. And probably one of the most memorable days was when it was raining. It was the first day of the season that it had rained. And when it started raining, everyone was like, do keep picking, going on. And the supervisors told us, like, no, it's fine. It'll pass. It's just a sprinkle. It's not just a sprinkle. It continued raining really, really hard. And I remember all the other kids had cell phones. So they were like calling their parents, like, come pick me up. It's raining. It's really ugly out here. But I did not have a cell phone. So I had to be there. And I did try picking, but it was just so hard because the berries would like burst in your hand and it was just very messy. So I remember just sitting there for almost an hour, like just soaking wet, hating my life until finally my mom came and picked me up at the time when it was supposed to be over. And I remember as we were driving away, we passed by the fields where the adult pickers were working, and none of them were leaving. They were still there. And I remember my mom telling me, she's like, see, these people have to work there because this is how they support their family. You're lucky that you're just doing this for the summer and that I came to get you. And I think that really just put it in perspective for me how, like, I just felt so bad for complaining about it when I was only doing it for a few weeks. And there were people who this was the way that they made their living.
I mean, in the essay, there's like another moment you also talk about where you're working again, not in the farm, but in the like the
in the
factory
processing plant.
Yeah. And then you once again have this realization that you realize that your experience is like different from that of some of the other workers, right? That you're, could you just recount that?
Yeah, I'll recap that. This happened back in 2014. It was the summer after my freshman year of college. I was struggling to find a summer job. And once again, my mom told me, she's like, well, go apply at Sakuma. They're always looking for workers. So I went and applied, and this time they placed me in their processing plant. And we were working with blueberries. So basically, I was in the freezer section, and there were these long conveyor belts. And as the berries were coming out, we would have to pick out the bad berries. So bad berries would be considered any that were too big or too small, too purple, too green, and we'd have to pick them out. And I also remember hating that job because we couldn't talk to anyone. It was just super loud. So we were just looking at the conveyor belt all day. I would get super dizzy. I always felt like throwing up the first few days. And then eventually they moved me into the lab section where I would check the berries' pH levels and go through the packages one last time to make sure that everything was ready to go to the buyers. And it was I was there like a week or so, and I just remember thinking, like, this isn't fair. Like there have been workers here who work here all year round and they've never been given this opportunity to go work in the lab because everyone knew that the people who worked in the lab had a much easier job than being there picking out all the berries. So that was another moment where I felt that something wasn't right here.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting anecdote, since it sort of like really highlights how like different people in the exact same job can have very different degrees of like power or just control over their own situations, like the power to sort of have somebody maybe respect you more and like pick you out of that and put you in a more comfortable or safe working environment. And I suppose that's where like organizations like the unions come in, right? To sort of like level that out. So you weren't like really you weren't part of the union that the workers formed, right? But you sort of watched it happen.
Yeah,
right?
I remember hearing everyone talking about how excited they were. The union was Families United for Justice, FUJ, and they had just formed the year before I started working in the processing plant. And they were fighting for better wages, better living conditions. Because I remember some of these cabins where they had the workers living in, my grandparents used to live in one of them. And I remember one year they had a really bad case of bed bugs and the walls were really thin, so it would get cold. So it was just not an ideal living condition. So that's what they were working towards changing. And then, yeah, I just remember everyone being really excited, thinking that change was going to come.
And yeah, how did their campaign sort of like play out?
So it was started by Ramon Torres, who used to work at the farm. And they ended up signing a really big contract with Sakuma, which they had never done before. So around 2014, the year that I was there, my colleagues had ended up winning a settlement from Sakuma. I think it was around $850,000 because Sakuma had been improperly logging their hours and they weren't getting sufficient breaks. And through that new contract, they were now paid $15 an hour and they were taking steps towards developing some sort of retirement plan for workers.
Right. So, I mean, I'm wondering a little bit now about how they've also done some like immigration work, right? Or sorry, community to community, and they're all like interconnected organizations, right? I'm wondering if you could just sort of tease out, like starting with, yeah, the immigration piece, like how do these like fights for working conditions and like how does labor organizing intersect with their sort of immigration fights?
Yeah, so community to community especially has worked with other organizations to pass legislature that provides better protection for H-2A workers. And H-2A is a program where employers can bring in foreign nationals from other countries to work in agricultural work. But a lot of people don't really like that program because it ties employees to a single employer, which just makes it so much harder for them to speak out about issues affecting them, like living conditions, wages, even things to sexual harassment. It's just so much harder for them to feel that they can speak up about that.
And how about the sort of climate change and environment piece? Like, where does that fit into their the organizing of like any of these organizations, labor union?
So I always thought that when I thought about farm work, I never made the connection between like, well, this is an environmental issue. But my uncle used to work at Sakuma and he worked in the greenhouse and would oversee the harvests. And he explained to me how important weather is, which I mean, now that I think about it, it makes sense. Weather affects everything. So weather is a really big issue because it's very unpredictable. Because if you don't know what the weather is, you don't know how many farm workers you're going to need to hire and stuff. So sometimes crops will come in, multiple crops will be ready at the same time, and that'll require more workers to come in. Otherwise, the crops go to waste if there's no one there picking it, and it loses the company money. But then on the other hand, if crops come in earlier, the harvesting season ends up lasting longer than usual, which requires fewer workers for longer periods of time. And then the temperatures, if it's too cold, it'll take longer for the crops to be ripe and mature, causing a later harvest. And then during hotter years, the crops grow too quickly and require more water. So because of that, it can be pretty difficult to predict each year's harvest because of the climate.
Right. I mean, I'm wondering what are these groups and organizations up to now? When you were writing about in your initial essay in the Seattle Globalist, that was at least 3 or 4 years ago, right? And then you would have finished working on the essay in this book like probably a couple of years ago, or at least a year ago. I'm wondering, is there an update on?
So since then, FUJ has signed another union contract, and this one is for 2019 to 2022. So it'll end sometime next year, and then we'll see what they do then. But the founder of the FUJ, Ramon Torres, he recently started his own farm up in Bellingham, his own berry cooperative. Right now, they're harvesting raspberries and blueberries. And the point they wanted to do this, like their overall goal is to have several farmers living on the land and contributing to the farm. So they want it to be more of a community rather than this big corporation that takes advantage of its workers. And right now they're staying afloat through grants and donations. And they're rejecting the idea that the production of food has to be as cheap as possible. Because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but many of the people picking these crops can't even afford to buy the own fruit that they pick when they go to the store just because it's so expensive. And then Community to Community has a lot of different projects going on right now. They've started doing a farm worker legislative day. So every year they take farm workers up to Olympia, which is the capital of Washington. And they get to speak with elected officials about policy changes, and they share their experiences in the fields to hopefully bring change about. And then they're also working on their Dignity campaign, which is a group of organizations and networks that are working towards immigration reform. And this bill would include legislation of undocumented immigrants, the legalization of undocumented immigrants, decriminalization of immigration status and work, equal rights, reunification of families, and an end to temporary and guest worker programs, and an end to free trade and the policies and the dislocation of people. So all these things kind of come together. So you have the environment issues, but then you also have the labor issues, and they're all pretty interconnected.
And it sounds like some of the legislation that they're putting is about getting better, just forcing employers and these like big farm corporations to treat their workers better. But then the farm cooperative is sort of their opportunity to build a different kind of business, actually, which is, I mean, cooperatives, right, are like member or worker owned, basically. So the workers are both workers and they own shares in the company, but they also control their working conditions, right? And as I understand it, some of them, they're mostly immigrants. You know, some of them have disabilities, and just that affects the conditions that they're able to work under as well. And I guess with the climate change aspect, I remember I also spoke to Ramon Torres like a couple of years ago or something about this. And I remember him talking at the time, it was like these intense, it was just intense wildfires all up the West, but especially the Pacific Northwest and like British Columbia. And he talked about how the cooperative would like give workers control over yeah, their own working conditions, like including on these hot smoking days where like they could make a decision, right, to not work for their own health and safety. And that would just be part of the business rather than, worrying that, a company, the company you work for is going to penalize you and revoke your visa or something. But yeah, thinking back to like how long ago you wrote that chapter, and you would have had no idea what was in the rest of the book. To be fair, at the time, I actually didn't really know either as we were putting it together. But I'm curious, like reading the book now, what other if there are like other chapters or stories that speak to you? Because when I listened to you talk and when I read your essay, there's you're talking about a very specific story, but there's so many like recurring themes in stories from all different kinds of communities, like people with different identities, different demographics, different regions, people urban, rural. So yeah, I'm just curious if, what you picked up.
So that chapter that you mentioned, the one about the coal mining community, I really liked that one, especially towards the end. There was a line where it said, directly impacted communities make for the most successful social justice movements. And that stuck out to me because I think it shows the power of local communities, and who else would know best what is affecting a community than the members of that community. So I really like that chapter. And then one of the earlier chapters, the largest toxic waste dump in the West, that one stuck out to me as well because the author mentioned living in farm worker labor camps. So that reminded me of my childhood and seeing my grandparents and parents live in those places. But then on top of that, they're dealing with something even worse because they have that waste dump basically in their backyard. And that one also just showed me how people can come from a family of activists and continue working towards making things better. Like it doesn't just happen overnight. Like there's multiple generations of people actively working towards making change.
Yeah, so I mean, for people who are listening and who haven't read the book yet, which is probably everybody, but that chapter that you just mentioned, the largest waste dump in the West, basically she comes from a farm worker family. Her father, maybe both her parents, organized with United Farm Workers. And so she watched them as a kid. She watched them doing community organizing. And then when she was living in this farm worker town and this like toxic waste dump, like moved into what was was sort of poisoning the town. There wound up being like a lot of birth defects in the town. She went and sort of drew on her observations of her parents community organizing and took that to organize her own community, which was like almost entirely Latinx, I think. And she applied that to this different but very very similar struggle that the same community was facing. First from their farm employees, their bosses, and then also with like the pesticide drift that they would experience, or just pesticides. I mean, they're working there right in the field. And so, yeah, it's, I just realized we should probably like shift to, it's 9:35, we should probably shift to questions.
Oh, yes.
Or 6:35, because I'm in New York City and you're in the West. Okay. Do you want to, okay, here. I'll read out the ones that seem to be coming through.
Okay.
So for Elizabeth, like, why did you feel like you were being treated differently than the other workers at the blueberry processing plant? That's a good question.
So, yeah, that is a good question because it's one that I've thought about for a long time. And I think there's multiple things. One, I was probably one of the youngest people working there. I was working with a lot of like older people, like 50 or older. So I have a feeling that maybe that's why they put me in there. And then a lot of the lab staff spoke English and they knew that I spoke English. So I think that probably had something to do with it as well.
And I mean, you've like gone to college at this point, and yeah, so I'm
that probably helped too.
Yeah. Okay, next one. How have we become so separated from the environment so much that we forget that we are even a part of it? Like you said, our workplaces and where we live are still part of the environment, but we don't think of them that way. Do you want to?
I think when we think of the environment, people automatically think of things like global warming or pollution, but we don't think about how things affect our local communities. We always think of the big picture, but we never really break it down to different communities and what they go through.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of this, this is actually like dates back to, like over a century, when the conservation movement, which is really like the precursor to the environmental movement in the United States, the conservation movement is kind of what in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it led to the creation of like national parks and whatever. And at the time, like nature and the environment was conceptualized as this thing that's beautiful, pristine, grand, sublime, like the mountains and the deserts of the West, the giant forests. And it's this thing that was meant to be like over there, away from our cities, which are, filled with sin and, vice and sin. And yeah, these just majestic vistas were meant to be preserved for, cultured people to enjoy. And so I think like as a society, as a country, we've just thought about nature as we think about like water, like rivers or whatever, as this thing that's in this separate space. And yeah, we think of the environment as this pristine nature. And then when it comes to things like, we drink water, it comes out of the taps. When we think about something like Flint, the Flint water crisis, Detroit water crisis, we think of those as like poverty issues or like public health issues or like political corruption issues. But that's poisoned water, and it's being brought to cities with pipes. Like that's the environment too, and yeah, we just don't, part of it, I think, is like we just silo a lot of these issues that are actually all super connected, into these like different separate categories. And I feel like that's starting to change. I don't know what everybody thinks, but I feel like after the 2016 election, people started to talk about this, and I hope it's starting to change. I think it's starting to change. And I think the climate and environmental justice movement is helping to, along with like the racial justice, just like the social movements, progressive social movements that are really powerful today are starting to highlight that how we need to be thinking about these issues in a much more holistic way. Okay. Do any of the chapters talk about the issue with dying bees? Sadly, they don't. There's a lot that is missing from this book. Most of the book focuses on communities sort of organizing in this like holistic space that's like they're fighting for something that makes their own living environment more humane, but also cleaner and more regenerative. Of course, we are extremely interconnected with dying bees, and they're such a huge part of what makes even our cities livable. But it is sadly a story that is left out of the book. But if you have read a great story, you should like put it in the chat so everybody can read it, including me. Okay. Where do a lot of these big farms fall on immigration issues? They need the labor, but they also abuse the labor, right? Are they at all politically engaged in immigration issues typically? Do you?
I would, yeah, I was gonna say that I think a lot of these farms are fully aware that most of their employees are undocumented from communities of color. And I like just from working at Sakuma, I feel like in a way they take advantage of that because they know how vulnerable these groups are. So because I doubt anyone else who wasn't undocumented would put up with a lot of the things that happen, at least a lot of the things that I've seen. So I'm not sure if they would be really big on like maybe making sure that everyone was documented or a citizen. I feel like in a way they kind of like that there's a lot of undocumented people.
Okay. I'm not seeing a lot of other questions coming through. I wonder if we want to wrap up or yeah, okay. I'll just say one more thing before we wrap up. Just going back to you were talking about one of the other personal essays about that third generation coal miner turned environmental activist.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you mentioned, you liked that he talked about how organizing comes from local conditions. One of the sort of issue silos that we didn't talk about tonight that he highlights in his book is that his sort of argument is that in the Appalachians, like in the coal mining region, there's like a very, very strong history of organizing, worker organizing through like United Mine Workers and just miner organizing. So there's actually a very long tradition of like progressive radical organizing. But because of the way, his argument is that because of the way that the environmental movement sort of has swept in the last like decade or two, sort of swept into the region with just its message about how like this industry is like destroying the environment. His argument is that that's actually like alienated a lot of like most of his neighbors because he's kind of making like almost like a culture war argument. He's saying that it's turning into this like what seems like a culture war argument, like the environmentalists are coming in and they're trying to highlight how mountaintop removal is like destroying, is polluting the water and whatever. But what his neighbors are hearing is you're like attacking our way of life. And so it's like what appears to be like a cultural rift when actually a lot of people, like everybody wants clean water, right? Everybody wants clean air. And a lot of it is how you frame it. So I just wanted to highlight that that's also like a part of, that's like one of the issue silos, I guess, that we often don't think about when we think about how, environmentalism is this like thing way off where, and in the other story that you mentioned, the Kettleman City, the largest toxic waste dump in the West. One thing that she talks about is how the companies actually, there was this report that came out in the 80s that found that a lot of industries were like actively, or these industries had this report that was like how to build a toxic waste dump. And their guidelines for themselves were like you should actually target minority communities, religious communities, probably communities that like don't, where folks don't really speak, like their English is not that good. They're poor, because it'll just like be easier to get something built there. And yeah, there was like a lot of anger in the community when this came out. And she talks in that essay or in that interview about how this is sort of an issue that has continued to, she talks about how her father doesn't really speak English, but he's like an excellent organizer. He's very able to speak for himself and, you know, is like very analytical about, you know, if officials or industry representatives come and like tell them things about how the toxic waste dump is safe. He just like can't do it in English comfortably. So yeah, he's been asked to like go to the back of the room, and she talked about how they actually, it became, they put up a fight about it. And the EPA, there was a whole like mediation around between industry and these workers over this language issue. And that's like when there was somebody in the audience that asked about the big farms and the immigration issues. It's really easy for workers to target or to just like exploit, and you know, workers who don't speak the language or don't have as much like cultural access, I guess, to the world of like the way that we talk about science and try to present scientific or public health issues. So yeah, that was a bit of a ramble, but I just wanted to highlight that before we, I don't know, close out. But maybe, I don't know, Elizabeth, maybe you should have the last word or anything to add.
I think you did a really good job of covering everything, but yeah, like Audrea said, the book covers a lot of different issues, and I think it just makes you really think about the way that we live in our communities. And yeah, I think she did a really good job. You guys should all read it.
Cool. Well, on behalf of Town Hall, I want to thank you both so much for presenting tonight. It sounds like a book that's full of really compelling stories that we just haven't really heard about. So thank you so much for your contributions and for putting it together, Audrea. I want to thank the audience for watching tonight as well. Thank you for your questions. I want to encourage you to purchase a copy of the book tonight from Third Place Books so we can support a local store. So use the link in the chat just below the player. So thank you both so much again. Best of luck in promoting the tour as you go along. And I hope you stay safe and have a great night.
Thanks for having us.